Good evening. If you'd like to open your Bible up to Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14, and I will tell you this on the front end. I don't think we'll get there, but we're going to skip around some before that, and I will kind of check the clock as we're going, and I don't expect to get there, but if we don't, that is your homework assignment, is to read Romans chapter 14, because it will kind of put some of what we talk about tonight into practice. So if you want to know just how old your preacher and his wife are, this weekend, this morning I guess, Nathan, our youngest, left on a school trip to Orlando. He's on a bus somewhere between here and there right now. David is chaperoning the high school group and is kind of the adult volleyball playing volunteer, I guess, up in Tecumseh today. And so I looked at my wife and said, hey, we got the house all to ourselves today. We had a marriage seminar a couple weeks ago. Who knows? And within about an hour, we're both sound asleep on the couch. And I learned something that I think I already knew but had reinforced for me this afternoon. Our dog is selfish. Our dog was not content to let the old folks in the house just enjoy the afternoon of sleep. Our dog wanted to be noticed. And so periodically the dog would just start barking for no apparent reason. Every now and then the dog would go to the door and one of us would kind of groggily wake up and walk over to let the dog out, and then the dog would walk away from the door. Then the dog would bring a toy and bring it to the edge of the couch just out of reach and then start barking at us. And that dog wanted attention all the time. And I will tell you, there are times with the dog that's incredibly frustrating. There are times with the dog it's kind of cute because she's a dog and that's what they do. We probably experienced something along those lines with kids along the way. You have had your kids when they were small that almost were like a little cat in the house where they would just knock something off a table just to do it and watch you pick it up only to knock it off the table again. They will cry for the attention of whatever it is that they need. And somewhere along the way, your hope is that they kind of grow out of that stage. Now, unfortunately, most of us in life have known some adults that never seem to quite get there. It seems like everything continues to revolve around them in life. Now, I can ashamedly admit that there have been times in life, hopefully not incredibly recent, although I don't know if I give myself that much credit, that I want my way. I want things done the way I think they should be done, and I'm selfish just like everybody else is. So this is another of those topics that when we run into it, I think, do I really want to preach about this? Because one, I'm not wanting to be hypocritical, and I know my own struggles. Two, the lady right there knows my struggles, and so she will remind me of them at some point. Did you actually say that in the sermon? Because this is what happened on Tuesday. But anyhow, we're going to talk about selflessness tonight. And so we'll start with the brief abbreviation from Webster of selfless, which I think is another Webster cop-out. Having no concern for self. You should not be allowed to use the word in the definition for the word, but that's the word if you look it up. So I think this is another of those places where we will benefit a little more from looking at the opposite, which is selfish, the thing we're trying to avoid. So here's what Webster says about selfish. Concerned excessively or exclusively with oneself. Concerned excessively or exclusively with oneself. Do you have a picture in your mind yet? I would imagine for a lot of us, we have experienced this along the way. We have run into people like this at work, in our neighborhoods, wherever it may be, and maybe in your house, where there is someone that's just everything kind of focuses on them. Or two, seeking or concentrating on one's own advantage, pleasure, or well-being without regard for others. Now think about that one for just a minute. So much of what we see around us in the world kind of comes back to this idea. It's we are very interested in how this affects me. Think of all the big debates going on in culture right now of various things. They're talking about student loan forgiveness. They're talking about gas prices, all those kinds of things. And maybe you have found yourself in those conversations, having an opinion one way or the other. And I think for most of us, what tends to happen, even if we're trying not to be selfish people, is that opinion is built on how it affects me. And so the gas price, for instance, if you'll remember mid-COVID, maybe early COVID, back kind of late spring of 2020, there was a point where I went to the East Stop over there by the Ada High School, and I put gas in my truck for 99 cents a gallon. I felt like I was in college again. It was great. And I filled my truck up for, it was like 16, 17 bucks, something like that. Wouldn't you like that now, by the way? And I remember being excited about it. I took a picture of the gas pump, of the price on it, and I put it on Facebook. And everybody was excited, wanted to know where I got gas, until I hit somebody who works in the energy industry. And they gave me a lecture about what it means when the gas price is that low. And I realized a lot of people are happy about gas prices right now, but there are a few that aren't. And now we're probably on the other end of the spectrum, where most of us are kind of annoyed with gas prices right now, and there's a group of people that are really excited about where they're at right now because that's how things go. Same thing with student loans or whatever else. We kind of get into this thing where it's all about what is my advantage, what's my pleasure, how does this affect me? Third, arising from concern with one's own welfare or advantage in disregard of others. And this is where it adds kind of another element to say, it's not just about me, but I don't care how it affects you. And I would imagine you have probably found yourself on the wrong side of this somewhere along the way in life. Maybe somewhere along the way in the last couple days. You have experienced something like this. And then there's another, which I thought was just kind of interesting. This is actually a scientific kind of definition. Selfish, a selfish thing scientifically, this is not talking about people necessarily. A selfish thing is being an actively replicating repetitive sequence of nucleic acid that serves no known function. Now, I know this is not exactly what we're talking about, but if we are going to think about selfishness biblically, what function does selfishness serve in the life of a Christian? If anything, maybe it serves the function of getting us further away from God, which is not a function that we want. And then the second part of that definition, genetic material solely concerned with its own replication. And maybe we see this within selfishness too, not just in genetic material, but in people. It's all about, I want more people to think like I do, act like I do, be like I do, value the things that I value. I want more of me out there. Now, I hate to let you in on this, but if there were actually more of you out there, those people would drive you crazy. Because we tend to gravitate towards people that are a little less like us than more like us. But for whatever reason, we just feel like, well, if there's just more of me out there, everything would be good. So what does the Bible say about selflessness? Now, if you go to your concordance and look for selfless, you're not going to find a whole lot. There may be some more modern translations that use the term, but we're going to see selflessness more as kind of a contrast from selfishness throughout Scripture. So first of all, selflessness is inherent in the greatest commands. I believe Butch brought this up in class this morning, the great command that we have to love one another. When Jesus is asked what the greatest commands are in Mark 12, he says, the most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Now, too many in our world have the love yourself down pretty good, although there are probably those in our world that even struggle with that idea. But loving neighbor has this tendency to place neighbor above self, because not everything I want aligns with what my neighbor wants. And if you live in a neighborhood, you have probably experienced this somewhere along the way. We live in a neighborhood that has a covenant. It's not an HOA. We don't have to pay dues or any of those kinds of things. But there are like these agreements within the neighborhood that you're not going to do this, you're not going to have this out in front of your house, whatever it may be, because you're trying to be good neighbors with everybody else around there. And there are times where I really appreciate that. There are other times I'm jealous of you guys that live out in the country and don't have to worry about that stuff because whatever goes, goes, and you don't have to worry. If we're being good neighbors, what our neighbors need, what our neighbors want, what our neighbors are concerned about rises above our concerns. And again, we struggle with that in our world because so much is geared toward what do you want, how does it affect you, what's your advantage? Jesus embodies selflessness. Now, we won't go into a lot of stories about Jesus tonight, but who he is selfless. And I think we have seen that throughout the spring as we've looked at the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus lives in such a way that is not about having himself rise above. It is about putting others above himself. In Mark 10:45, it says that for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So if you were to ask Jesus, why are you here? There's the plan, there's the obedience to the Father, there are all these things, but there is a big piece of it that is he came to serve. He came not to be served, although that happened from time to time, but he came primarily to serve. He wants to give himself for others. And in Luke 22:42, Jesus says this when he's praying in the garden, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And so he doesn't just put us above himself, he also puts the will of the Father above his own. Because in his mind, there's got to be a different way to do this. There's got to be an easier way. There's got to be a way that doesn't involve the struggle that's about to come. But if there's not, then I will go through and I will do this. I will put the will of the Father above my own. Selflessness also permeates the Sermon on the Mount. Now, we have gone through the Sermon on the Mount not terribly long ago. We did an abbreviated version of it earlier in our study of Matthew, but I just want to hit a couple highlights here to remind us. In Matthew 5:22, he says, I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So anger is something that we cannot harbor. Even though it feels justified, even though we feel like it's something that we deserve, we cannot have that. In verse 28, he says that everyone that looks with a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart, which is to say, we cannot treat people like objects. That's what selfishness does. Selfishness says, how can I use this person to my advantage? We don't talk in those terms most of the time. Now, every now and then, you'll probably hear somebody say things like that. But most of the time, I think we're kind of innocent about how we're going about it. But in reality, we're trying to set up people and situations to get the result that helps us. That's kind of the way the world is geared. And Jesus says, no, you don't treat people as objects. In verse 37, he says, let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So the words that we say have impact, and our truthfulness matters. We'll talk about truthfulness and honesty later on a Sunday evening. But there's this little piece of it that, why do we lie? Why do we try to make oaths that we have to keep and others that we don't? And if I swear this way, then it counts. And if I don't swear this way, it doesn't count. It's all to bring things to our advantage. We say things, we tell little lies that quickly become bigger lies and then bigger lies and then things out of control because we are trying to not take the heat for what we deserve. We're trying to set things up in such a way that we can get the thing that we want. We say things to try to get where we want to go. And then verse 39, he says, I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. So when someone hits you, everything within you says, I don't deserve that, and I'm going to get back at them. And Jesus says, no, don't do that. Just a couple weeks ago, we looked at the story of everything that led to the cross. How many times was Jesus struck? How many times was he spat on? How many times was he mistreated and mocked? And at every one of those turns, he could have done something different, and yet he does exactly what he taught all the way back in Matthew 5. In chapter 6, it says, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So the purpose of our giving is not recognition. It's not so people will notice or reward us somehow. We give because it's the godly right thing to do. We don't give because of what advantage it brings us. We give because God calls us to give. So it's not about me, my advantage, or my position. The focus is on others. And if we have to ask ourselves, okay, am I being selfish? Then this is probably the question that we could ask. Am I doing this for my advantage? Am I doing this for my position? Is the focus on me, or is it on other people? And if it's on me, there's a pretty good chance what I'm doing is selfish. If it's about me, it's not about others, it's not about God. Selflessness changes our motivation. And this is kind of the core of our struggle with selfishness and selflessness. We are motivated so much from the day we're born by fulfilling our own needs. You have a baby at home. What does that baby do at some point? It begins to cry. What does that baby want? Well, you start to learn the different cries that mean different things, and if you give them the right thing, then the crying will stop most of the time, and then you will carry on with life. And we have got that thing that just continues and goes and goes and goes, and we bring it on into adult life. But if we are selfless people, then our motivation is not us, it's God and it's others. In Luke chapter 6, in Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, he says this, but love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. So loan, expecting nothing in return. Would not recommend this at your bank on Monday morning. You probably won't be able to go in and say, I'd like a loan. I hope you don't expect anything in return. As Christians, we kind of operate a little differently. If you've ever listened to Dave Ramsey talking about people asking from time to time, should I loan my relative money that's in some kind of bind and they need to get bailed out? And usually his response will be something along the lines of, not if you ever expect to see it again. If you consider this a gift that if they pay it back, it's a bonus, then fine. otherwise no. We experience that in the church office. We will have people come in every week or call every week needing help with something, some bill. And in the time that I've been here, almost 5 years now, I can think of 2 or 3 times where we've gotten a call later, 3, 4 months later, from a non-church member who says, hey, I called you guys. And we don't, we'd have no way of going to find them and say, it's time for you to, we don't ask for the money back, but they called and said, you helped me out when I needed help. I have since gotten a job, I've been paid, and I would like to repay what you guys gave me. And usually there's silence on our end of the phone for just a moment as we're trying to collect ourselves, and we say, sure, we didn't expect that, but I think that's a good habit. That's a good thing to do. And so if you'd like to do that, great. And come do that, and we'll put that money to good use and help somebody out. Or if you find yourself down on your luck 6 months from now, come find us again, and we'll do the same. So when we loan, we're not expecting in return. It's not for our advantage. Our motivation has changed. When we do good, it's not for the reward or the recognition. It's because it's the right thing to do. Selflessness also changes our thinking. And motivation and thinking are closely tied together, but motivation has more to do with when we're actually going to do something. We think a lot more than we do, don't we? Unless you're a whole lot different than I am. I think a whole lot of things I never do. But my thinking so often will go towards how do things affect me. Philippians 2, which we have referenced multiple times in class and on Wednesday and all over the place because it's so essential to Christianity. Philippians 2 says this, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. We're not thinking about ourselves. We're not thinking about the advantage for me. We're thinking about how does this affect somebody else? And that's tough to think, isn't it? Because every inconvenience that comes your way, how hard is it to get past the point of thinking of how it inconveniences you to how it may affect somebody else? And maybe sometimes it inconveniences them as well, but maybe sometimes there's something about that you never even thought of. And it's a good for someone else. It's an advantage for somebody else. It's helpful for somebody else. So Paul says, don't just think about you, think about others. But then selflessness also changes our actions. So it changes motivation, changes mindset, changes the way we think. But hopefully as Christians, what it should do next is change what we are actually doing. Because it's one thing to think, I really should consider others more often. It's one thing to think, I really should stop doing things that are designed to get me ahead and don't think about other people. But what about if we start to actually do those things? How will lives change? Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 10. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Now, I've learned early on that you're not supposed to speak in a lot of absolutes. I remember in marriage counseling, premarital counseling, we're not in marriage counseling, premarital counseling long ago before we got married, they told us a number of things, but one of the things that was to try to steer away from all and never. You always do this, and maybe you've caught yourself, spouses, by the way. You always do this, you never do this, for a couple reasons. One, they're not true. You're exaggerating. They don't always or never do anything. None of us do. But it puts people on the defensive, and so we tend to not think that way, but think of all the absolutes here that Paul has to say. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. So there's a lot that is permissible. There's a lot of things that we can do, but some of those things aren't necessarily a good idea. And I think we can see that in our world very clearly. There are a lot of things that by the letter of the law you can do, but sometimes it's not a good idea to do it. It changes with the situation that's going on. As I drive from Ada into Oklahoma City, if I decide to go through Norman, the chances that I'm going to be able to maintain 60 or 65 on I-35 all the way through Norman, depending on time of day, are pretty slim. I know that's the speed limit posted on every sign, and it is lawful for me to go 65 or 60, whichever it is at the particular time. But if the traffic in front of me is not a good idea. And I get that in those kinds of situations, but when it comes to our interpersonal stuff, we miss it sometimes. We think so much in terms of, well, I should be allowed to. These are my rights. This is the way we think as Americans. We talk a lot about rights. Even the things that are allowed sometimes are not a good idea. And so all things are lawful, but not all are helpful. All are lawful, but not all build up. So maybe there are things that we can do or say that we can excuse, that we can try to point to a chapter and verse somewhere or a principle somewhere and say, this is okay, but is it helpful? You know, there are times where you are going to find a brother or sister who is doing something that is completely wrong. And in pointing out that wrong, you would probably be completely right biblically to do so, but how do you go about doing it? So is it just a letter of the law thing where they have done wrong and I rebuke because I'm the other brother and that's what we do and all of that? Or is there something deeper than that I have to get some nuance within this to try to accomplish the thing that we're trying to accomplish? So all are lawful, but not all build up. And then let no one, so another absolute, you've got all the alls and now you've got no. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. So that is to say, if I ask you who is good at being selfless, who do you experience in your life that is very selfless? Who do you know within our church that's very selfless? And you begin to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 names or faces come into your mind, what should be happening for us as Southwest Church of Christ is the names are coming so fast you can't keep them straight. We are so good at being selfless. We are so good at putting others above ourselves that it's difficult to isolate just 1 or 2 people. This is just who we are and what we do. And if we take these words of Paul, let no one do this, this is pretty serious. This is one of those command kind of things, and a command that's clearly universal. All of these things are this, and let nobody do it this way. Let no one live selfishly. Selfishness is also the cause of many of our cultural problems. If there is nothing else that you're completely on board with tonight, I will bet you totally get this idea. So much of sin, so much of cultural issues, it all comes back to selfishness. James says this in James 3, 14 through, I believe, 17. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. Could James talk about this any more negatively? When we are doing the selfish things, they are earthly things, they're unbiblical things, and as if that's not enough, they're demonic things. We don't talk Satan a whole lot, but it is the influence of Satan that is causing this kind of stuff to happen. And we can look in our world and we see this very clearly. Unfortunately, too many folks can look in churches and see these kinds of things clearly too, where selfishness kind of takes over. And so we need to be people who are not of this, but instead, where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice, okay? So this is our world, is it not? Disorder and vile practice. I mean, we could categorize most of it there, couldn't we? All the things that we struggle with, the things we're outraged about, the things people protest against, the things people boycott because of, they're all this disorder, vile practice, and all of this comes out of selfishness. But then on the other side, selflessness, did I say selfishness the first time, by the way? That was the one time I had selfishness instead of selflessness in there. Selfishness is the cause of all those things, not selflessness, just in case I said it wrong. Selflessness is the cure for many of our cultural problems. It really is that simple. And I know Jesus is the cure. I know following him is the cure. But as far as what we're doing, what we're thinking, how we're motivated, selflessness is the cure. James continues in verse 17. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. So you've got all these things from below that are selfishness, and then this stuff from above that's the opposite. And it's pure, and it's peaceable and gentle. It's all the things that we want to be. And when we are these things, then the disorder and the evil and all of that, it's difficult for that to exist in this context, because this sheds too much light on it. And then Paul says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy or boast, it is not arrogant or rude, it does not insist on its own way, it is not irritable or resentful. Selflessness is also foundational to God's design for the church. And this is, if you've been wondering, this is where it fits in with what we talked about this morning with connecting his family. The church functions at its best when we are people who are selfless. And if you think of, all of us have encountered some sort of church split within our extended family, I would imagine at this point. I hate being able to say that confidently. I like to think it's something that you heard about somebody's roommate's second cousin from college way down the road, but for most of us, it's way closer than that. You know somebody somewhere that's been involved in a split. I still remember sitting one day at home in Arkansas and getting a call about a church split in Mobile, where I was from, and assuming that the guy on the other end was telling me about the wrong church. There were 2 churches there in Mobile. One was University and one was University Boulevard. and they got confused a lot. And he told me that one of them had split, and it was the one that I had been a member of when I was in high school, and I thought, there's no way. That church is too solid, that church is too good, never would have happened. And sure enough, he was right. It was the church that I had known and loved, and these people I had gone to church with were now separated in different places. It was about a 300-member church. About 100 of them went one direction, about 200 of them went the other direction. And there were people that had gone to church together for their entire lives that if they saw each other in Walmart, turned and went down the next aisle. They didn't want the awkward conversation. They didn't know, they were angry because they blamed whoever it was for it. It took years and years and years for those relationships to be fixed. Selflessness is how church is supposed to work. And most of those splits that we have seen, they're occasionally about a doctrine, they're occasionally about something biblical. Most of the time they're not. Most of the time they're about an opinion about something, or we like the preacher or we don't like the preacher, or we want this or we want that, or one group is trying to push this or that, and then this tension begins. And we've all heard the anecdotal stuff about the color of the carpet and things. I don't know if that actually exists, but I've heard the stories too. It's all selfishness, isn't it? It's all, I want things my way, and when we do church that way, it doesn't work. And so selflessness is the design for the church. Colossians chapter 3, maybe I should have you turn here because we'll actually end here, but still, Romans 14 for your homework. Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 9, Paul says, "Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices." So you had this old self. You had who you were before. For those who are married, you understand what this is to a degree. Not to the level probably here, but you understand the level of this. There were things before you were married that may have been the thing that you would do. Now, I'm not saying you completely change your personality, and if you, by the way, are dating somebody thinking they'll change when we get married, they won't. They're still be the same person. But sometimes the things you did before you were married are not things that you any longer do afterward. I would hang out with guys and go do whatever, whenever, however long. I didn't have to tell anybody about it. I was an adult. I just did whatever. And once I'm married, I can still go hang out with guys, but I at least got to be considerate about it. And then I have to balance that out and not do too much of that and not enough with my wife. And there's all kinds of stuff that goes with it. We understand there's an old self and a new self. The same thing with us as Christians. There was who you were before. Now, for a lot of us, who you were before may not look a lot different than who you are now. Because for a lot of you, your grandparents went to church, your parents went to church, you have been to VBS for as long as you could remember, and when you finally reach the point where you're baptized, it's not like life has totally changed for you. You knew memory verses before. You were here before. You did good things before. You served other people before. But the focus, the motivation, the things we think on, they all begin to change. And so this old self, and the example Paul uses is lying, the old self that would lie, that self is gone. So for us, we struggle a little bit with this because we tend to do things situationally. In creation, which I think is where we see God's design in this, we don't see that. I think of, for instance, there are different critters that have shells. We have snails, we have different kinds of little crabs that run along the beach and all that kind of stuff that have shells. And they reach a point as they grow that they outgrow the shell that they have, and then they will get a new shell. Now, could you imagine, as these animals grow and they get new shells and grow into that, if they continued to carry around the old ones, what that might look like? Could you imagine, I don't like snakes at all, but if you like snakes, if the snake that sheds its skin, instead of you finding a snake skin somewhere in your garage and freaking out wondering where the snake is at, what if that snake dragged around every skin behind it? And then suddenly you have like a 40-foot long snake going across your backyard, but it's just a bunch of little snake skins. In nature, we don't see that. In people, we see it all the time to the point that we've just come to accept it. They're not supposed to be that anymore, but they just can't let go of it. So in verse 10, Paul says this, "And have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." So you have this new self, and what this new self is, it's the image of God. We talked this morning a little bit about the image of God. I guess it was right after what we talked about. We talked about the idea of the image of God when we talked about rendering to Caesar what is Caesar and whose image is on the coin. We talk about the image of God when we look at Genesis, but as we are being the new self, it is the image of God that God has designed from the beginning for us, taking root and taking fruit, more than that. In verse 11, he says, "Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is Christ is all and in all. Or as we said this morning, there is not farmer or accountant or teacher or coach or male or female or whatever it may be. There is just Christian. We are all here. And there are no longer divisions. And we talked this morning quite a bit about one faith and one Lord and one baptism, and the fact that we are to have this unity where we are connected together as one. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. So you are to have all these characteristics, which, by the way, is why we're spending Sunday evenings over this year talking about characteristics of Christians. We are to be these things. We are to have these things. And notice the ones he listed, by the way. Compassionate hearts, empathy, compassion, as we talked about this morning. Kindness, humility, meekness, patience. Notice, by the way, there's not a qualifier here. There's not a, when you encounter people who deserve these things, you should be kind and compassionate and all of that. Because, by the way, you're going to encounter a lot of people that don't deserve these things. The way they act toward you, the world would say, well, you can act whatever way you want. You are content. You deserve that. And God would say, no, you be these things anyway. And then he says, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. So we have these characteristics, and now we have actions. And notice the actions he describes. Bearing with one another. Okay, so we are going to be patient. We're going to assume the best. When the brother or sister offends you, you're going to assume, number one, it wasn't intentional. Even if you just know it was intentional, you're going to assume it wasn't. Two, you're going to assume, maybe I'm thinking of this in a way that they did not think of this, and so I'm taking it not in the way it was intended. Or maybe what they said, they didn't understand how it would come across, and so you give them all this leeway. And then forgiving. Why? Because once in your life you have misspoken. Long ago, you have it written down in a journal somewhere from 34 years ago, you misspoke that one time, and you desperately wish you could take that back. You want forgiveness, you want correction. We all misspeak, probably a whole lot more frequently than that. And so we want the same reaction that we would give. We want to turn around, and that forgiveness we're looking for ourselves, we want to then give it to others. And above all these, put on love, which binds together everything in perfect harmony. So you have love, as we talked about in 1 Corinthians 13. Love undergirds all of this, and that perfect harmony that we have comes from love. I didn't want to bring in instrumental music tonight for the controversy, but there is a clip on YouTube I absolutely love that is a junior high band that is playing the theme from the 2001 Space Odyssey. And there's a German name for that song. Richard probably knows, he can tell you later. But they are playing it as poorly as you could imagine it would be played. They are not in tune. They're not coming in at the right times. And I've actually seen a YouTube clip where they have paired it with the scene from 2001 Space Odyssey, and it's hysterical. And they are not remotely in harmony. And it's laughable to look at, but too many churches sound like that. Not because of the music or any of those things, but because we are not together. And what Paul tells us is what leads to that harmony is love. It's the kind of love that assumes the best. It's the kind of love that wants to forgive rather than blame. It's the kind of love that acts this way, feels this way, shows kindness and compassion instead of anger. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body, and be thankful. And so when you do these things, what you're going to find is peace. You're going to have this peace, and because you have this peace, you are going to be thankful. The puppy finally stopped being selfish in about the last 20 minutes of the nap time, and it was great. Except I woke up with a crick in my neck, but that's a whole other story. She stopped, finally. There is something about that peace that comes when the selfishness is gone. And I think you will find that. If you look around in your relationships and it seems like a constant battle, seems like a constant back and forth where everybody's jockeying for position, when you let loose of that, there is a peace that comes with that is just not explainable in human terms. And I believe we find that peace because we are finally living this out the way God designed. There's something about seeing something work exactly the way it is supposed to work. If you build things, maybe you have seen that somewhere along the way, where all of those pieces that you cut, all of those things that you design in a certain way, all fit together and it works just right. God has done that for us. He has designed all of this. And I believe he takes a great pleasure when he sees it all working in exactly the way it was supposed to, when we live it out and perfect it in that way. So how do we get there? How do we, if we are struggling with selfishness, if we live in a world that is so characterized by selfishness, how do we flip it around and get to selflessness? First of all, John the Baptist, I think, lets us in on the secret all the way back in John 3, early in the gospel, when he says, he must increase, but I must decrease. There must be more of Jesus and less of me. If there is more of Jesus, if I'm focusing more on him, what he does, how he interacts with people, what's important to him, then by nature, I'm going to focus more on my neighbor, on my brother, on my sister, on the people around me. I'm not going to first think of everything that's wrong with them, but I'm going to see them as people. How many frustrating people do you think Jesus encountered in the course of a day? People that wanted to trap him, people that didn't understand him, people that just wanted to take, people that had all these different motivations. And how frequently do you see Jesus just lash out at somebody? Not very often, is it? And by the way, the thing that should scare us most is generally the religious people when he does it. He doesn't do it very much. He has a lot of patience with people. So first of all, more of him, less of me. Secondly, in Galatians 2:20, Paul says this, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I think the 4th and 5th graders were singing this one last Wednesday night. We have been crucified with Christ, so we are living by faith. We are not living by all that old self stuff, by that criteria. We are living now by God's criteria, by the way that he would design us to live. And we're not dragging around the dead skins and the shells that are too small and any of that anymore. We are now new and living in a new way. And then where we were reading in Colossians in chapter 3, verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. We are connecting as family, as we talked about this morning. The word of Christ is dwelling in us richly. So God came to be with us. As we looked at the beginning of Matthew, he reminds us he's still with us as he leaves at the end of Matthew. And now his word and his spirit dwell in us, and they dwell in us richly. And when we do that, we speak through that and with that and admonish and encourage and build each other up, and we are connecting as family. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Do everything in his name. So what does Paul mean when he says everything? Everything. All things. Everything we do, we are doing in his name. So when you get up in the morning and your body makes sounds it never used to make when you were younger, you're going to live out that day in his name. And when it seems mundane and unimportant, you're going to do it in his name. And when you are, like a lot of us were this afternoon, customers in a restaurant somewhere with service that may have been the best you ever had or the worst you ever had, you are living that out in his name. And when you go to work tomorrow, for those of you with jobs, you are doing that in his name. And when you're retired, for those of you who are retired, you are living out retired life in his name. When you are the spouse or the parent or the child in your house, you are doing that in his name. If you live by yourself in the interactions that you have, you are doing that in his name. The way you conduct yourself, even alone, you are doing that in his name. In all things, we are acting in his name because it is not about me, it is about him. And when I make it about him instead of me, and when I make it about others and those around me instead of me, then I will become the selfless person that he has designed me to be in the first place. Now, I would imagine that if most of us are being honest with ourselves, this may be the most universal problem we all have. Because at some level, pretty much all of us struggle with this somewhere along the way. Even if you are just the most genuine, compassionate, kind person in the world, every now and then somebody's going to do something that gets under your skin. And what do? And God would say to us, bear with one another, forgiving, kindness, love, selfless. Do it in the way that his son did it when he was here. If you are not selfless tonight, it's a work in progress for anybody who's trying. Don't beat yourself up when you're not getting there as quickly as you'd like to get there, but don't give up either. Continue down that path. If you have never followed him for the first time, you can die to the old life as well and rise to walk in a new life. and you can start on that road to be a more selfless person as He designed you. Or if you have found yourself just getting rooted down in selfishness again, you can come back, you can acknowledge Him again, and you can set your mind on things above. If there's some way we can help you, please come while we stand and sing.